Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. It's great to see so many of you here today. It's a full house, I believe, so thanks for being here. My name is Mike Anderson. I'm an executive at Saab as well as a board director here at the Atlantic Council. On behalf of Saab and the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, as well as its Forward Defense Program, I would like to welcome you to this exciting installment of our 2024 Commander Series titled Road to Washington with General Christopher Cavoli on the NATO Summit. General, thank you so much for being here at the Commander Series today. Appreciate it. A little bit about the Commander Series. When Saab and the Atlantic Council first launched the program back in 2009, our vision was to establish a flagship speakers forum for senior military and defense leaders to discuss the most important security challenges, both now and in the future. This series has been very useful for defense companies like Saab, helping us better understand challenges and priorities in order to inform our investments and partnerships, particularly when it comes to research and development, while better preparing ourselves to meet future capability needs. Today's event is the second installment of the Commander Series this year. We hosted our first successful event in the series last month with General Sir Jim Hockenhull of UK Strategic Command. Looking back at our series in 2023, we had the honor of hosting 5 commanders throughout the year for a range of vibrant discussions. And I would also like to take this opportunity to announce our next guest speaker already on May 22nd. We then have the honor of hosting the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown. But today, we really look forward to listening to the Commander of U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Christopher Cavoli. General, thank you again for spending time with us today. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce General James Jones, who will introduce our guest and moderator. General Jones is an Executive Chairman Emeritus at the Atlantic Council, as well as the founder of Jones Group International. General Jones has a wealth of experience throughout his career, including serving as National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama. General Jones retired from the Marine Corps in 2007 after a distinguished 40-year career. This included his role as the 32nd Commander of the U.S. Marine Corps, followed by his role as Commander of U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Please welcome the one and only General Jim Jones to the stage.
Thank you, Mike, very much for that introduction, and thank you for Saab's continuing support to this wonderful program since 2009. So really, we do appreciate it very much. And thank you all for coming to today's event with General Cavoli, who has, as you know, 2 hats, Commander of the U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander Europe. In 2022, Russia shattered the veil of European security, bringing back war to the European mainland and disrupting the peace dividend the transatlantic alliance had enjoyed for decades. Now, in the 3rd year of Russia's war, we're reminded that aggression and revisionism must always be met with clear, swift, and collective action by the United States and its allies and partners. In response to Russia's renewed revanchism, NATO has demonstrated collective resolve through its support for the heroic actions of Ukraine and its people, commitment to a stronger alliance with the addition of Sweden and Finland, and just 2 months ago, and the adoption of a new regional defense plan developed to defend every inch of NATO territory. But the work is not yet finished. Russian reconstitution efforts, threats emanating from the People's Republic of China, and the weaponization of emerging technologies and new warfare tactics threaten global security more broadly. At the Washington Summit this July, allies and partners must contend with ongoing and emerging threats to support Ukrainian sovereignty, modernize allied capabilities, and safeguard the democratic values that underpin the alliance. In this spirit, convenings such as these are integral to the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, which works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and our allies and partners. So today's event is part of the Atlantic Council's programming in the lead up to the Washington NATO Summit. So before I introduce our distinguished guests, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is on the record. Later in the discussion, we'll encourage the audience to direct any questions using the microphone stands at the front of the room, as has already been mentioned. The first Supreme Allied Commander was General Dwight David Eisenhower, who became SACEUR on the 2nd of April, 1951. His deputy SACEUR was Field Marshal Montgomery, both historical figures. I was privileged to be the 14th in the line of succession, and I'm honored today to introduce the 20th Supreme Allied Commander and Commander of the European Command, General Chris Cavoli. Each of the SACEURs since President Eisenhower sat in the chair have had the privilege of sitting behind his desk at SHAPE. And as a matter of fact, the Deputy SACEUR's desk belonged to Field Marshal Montgomery. When I was SACEUR, the Deputy SACEUR had decided to have Montgomery's desk renovated, and in pulling out all the drawers and everything else, there was a speech in his own handwriting where it was his final speech to the NAC as he was retiring for good, and written in his own handwriting, and it was quite a find that had been sitting in that desk for so many years. So not to put any additional pressure on General Cavoli, but Politico recently named him as the most important leader outside of Ukraine who can influence the outcome of the war. And I believe that to be true as well. In his position at both EUCOM and at SHAPE, it is really, we're fortunate to have someone of his caliber in that position. General Cavoli has a distinguished career. He was a graduate of both Princeton and Yale, having been commissioned in the Army in 1987, and has served in a wide variety of positions throughout the United States, Europe, and Asia. I'm also delighted to announce that in recognition of General Cavoli's unparalleled dedication to international peace and security, the Atlantic Council will present him with one of the organization's highest awards, the Distinguished Military Leadership Award, which celebrates the highest achieving individuals who embody the essence of the pillars of the transatlantic relationship. General Cavoli, it's an honor to have you here today, and we look forward to your comments and the questions that I'm sure will follow. So it's my honor to ask you to take the floor.
Thank you, General. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Oliver. General Jones may not remember, but when I was Lieutenant Cavoli, General Jones was commanding a Marine unit in northern Iraq, and my battalion, which was led by a guy named John Abizaid, was attached to his MU. And so it's a pleasure to see you again, General Jones. No, there's no pressure in my job at all from the past. You know, I have a bust of Eisenhower behind my desk. It weighs on me every day, right? You know, you mentioned the desk, General. When I first got to SHAPE, I went up to see the U.S. military representative to the military committee, John Diedrich, Lieutenant General, works for the chairman. And he told me, you know, sir, I have a piece of furniture that I really think should be in your quarters. It's the original desk at which Eisenhower sat when he signed the activation order for SHAPE. And I said, that's fantastic, for two reasons. First, it should be in my office. But second, I have a desk in my office that has the exact same plaque on it. So this started a long research project on the part of Dr. Ian Hope, our SHAPE historian, who discovered that, in fact,
the desk in the office was the desk at which it was signed. So the legend remains intact, sir. And importantly, Monty's desk with the 6 chairs around it has 5 chairs now. Nobody knows where the 5th one went, but there's a lot of speculation about it. So General Jones, Mr. Anderson, Excellencies, it's so good to be here tonight. My old friend Andrew Mikta, it's a pleasure to see you again. Many thanks to the Scowcroft Center, the Atlantic Council, and to Saab for putting all this together. So as you know, we're facing very challenging times in the European theater. We had hoped for something quite different. We have rising problems in the Indo-Pacific. We have continuing problems in the Middle East. The last thing we wanted was for European security to be in question too. But since Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, we've seen that country progressively seek to undermine freedom and democracy throughout the continent and beyond. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its subsequent invasion of the Donbass, yes, invasion, we know that Russian regular troops led the way. These continued the pressure. Then in 2022, in February, Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and brutal invasion of Ukraine fundamentally altered our strategic landscape. The war in Ukraine has compelled us to reevaluate our longstanding goals, our ideas regarding global security and international relations, and it has consequently forced us to re-examine how the NATO alliance is structured to deter and defend against our adversaries. So a bit of history. Following the Cold War, the alliance no longer believed that we had a need to focus on collective defense, and we instead turned our attention to crisis management operations, so-called out-of-area operations. These operations were characterized by rather small size. Brigades were the typical unit of employment. They tended to be very far away, not on our turf, but on ground that changed with each mission. And of course, we engaged in those missions on our terms, on our timelines. So they were small, varied, and were done on a predictable schedule. And we optimized for that. The alliance optimized for that, and nations individually optimized for that. Our force structure, we shifted our processes, our procedures, our very expectations. Most importantly, we developed cyclical processes to generate forces. This gave us the opportunity to collect the famous peace dividend that we had all expected after the Cold War. If the only unit that needs to be truly ready is the unit that is deployed, and if its deployment is predictable and scheduled, and we don't require forces above that echelon, say the brigade level, then we can find many, many economies in our military forces, and we did. Troops at echelons above brigade, we cut. Readiness in non-deployed units, we lowered. Fighting headquarters, logistics, air and missile defense. We built small, highly expert militaries that didn't expect to face a peer and had little force in reserve. All that has changed. The war we see in Ukraine could not be more different. This war is about hard power, and it is about scale. It is huge. Dozens of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, thousands of tanks lost, thousands of tanks lost. It is about big units, divisions, corps, air armies, fleets, and it is happening all the time, 24/7, no respite for more than 2 years. It could not be more different than what we had been preparing to do. So the alliance recognized that. At Madrid in June of 2022, nations instructed SACEUR to revitalize our ability to conduct collective defense. After 2008, Georgia, we had already had an agreed strategic approach to deter and defend in the Euro-Atlantic area. We had a document, we had a strategic approach. We called it the Deterrence and Defense of the Euro-Atlantic Area, DDA. So at Madrid in 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, or the second invasion of Ukraine, SACEUR, in this case Todd Walters, was instructed by heads of state and government to immediately implement that strategic approach, to immediately implement DDA. Easy to say, hard to do. DDA's basic premise is that we posture NATO forces and authorize them to operate functionally and geographically to deny our adversaries any advantage they might seek in geography, readiness, or domain. And this, of course, has required a wholesale modernization of our collective defense system because we had previously been optimized for a very different task. So the first thing we've done is to write plans. Plans. The last general defense plan that the alliance politically authorized was the GDP of 1989. Since these were refreshed on 5-year cycles, in 1994, the alliance, reasonably enough, allowed the GDP to expire. So we need to recognize this. For the first time in 30 years, heads of state and government of our alliance said we need a plan for our common defense. This is fundamental. It is having huge consequences. So NATO wrote those plans in very short order, 18 months from beginning to their approval. In fact, if I could observe this, the development and approval of these plans, which involved multiple NATO headquarters, 30 and then 32 nations and their militaries and their national defense plans and their sovereignty. With all of these political and military complexities, it has been the single most impressive collective military feat I have seen to get these things done. And the fact that there was not a single military objection in the approval process is an indicator of the great cohesion, the great unity we find politically in the alliance today. So those plans are in place now. They're classical defense plans, geographically specific descriptions of how, where, and with what we will defend every inch of this alliance. And so they're the basis of all of our transformation. First, they give us a force structure requirement. For the first time in almost 4 decades, the alliance has an objective, militarily sound, plans-based description of the forces that we require. This requirement will guide nations' defense spending. So over the years since Wales, I've often been asked, isn't 2% just an arbitrary figure? Well, now I can say there are specific things we need you to build, specific things we need you to buy, specific levels of readiness we need you to maintain. And I think you will find that 2% is certainly not a ceiling, but a floor. What we have finally done is to find and develop and agree on a blueprint for burden sharing, a blueprint that establishes how much nations will need to provide. Second, the new plans give us a map for different delegations of authority for operational decision-making. For years, during the years of luxurious optionality provided by out-of-area operations, nations withheld many basic military authorities to the political level. Such things as movement of troops from staging area to operational areas, that sort of thing. That no longer works. In order to be able to act and react at the speed of relevance, SACIR requires basic military authorities. These are working their way through the new modernized alert system, and I'm happy to say they're on the verge of being approved in Brussels today. Third, our systems of command and control needed to change too. They had been optimized for crisis management. They were focused on cyclical deployments to distant regions instead of concentrating on a specific piece of geography. We had taken apart the structures needed for high-end warfare, structures at the echelons above brigade level, corps artillery, aviation brigades, large-scale logistics, and so forth. And we had dissociated corps headquarters from their subordinate tactical units. It all made sense for our missions at the time, rotations, but it's unsuitable for large-scale territorial defense. So for DDA, we needed headquarters to intimately understand the terrain, know the populations, appreciate the particular adversary across the border. So we're in the process now of designing specific geographic areas, of assigning specific geographic areas to each corps headquarters and to maritime headquarters. And we're matching divisions and brigades to the corps, which allows them to exercise and rehearse together. Now, each headquarters will be able to know exactly what terrain it's required to defend, with what tactical units, and can prepare accordingly. Finally, we have begun to rigorously test our plans through a revamped exercise program. Just last month, we had a theater-wide rehearsal of concept exercise at SHAPE, in which every commander in Allied command operations, from 2 stars up to 4 stars, walked across an enormous map on the floor of their gymnasium and described blow by blow the actions his command would take in executing all of the regional plans. And right now, we're in the middle of Steadfast Defender 2024, a theater-wide live exercise that is the largest live exercise we have done since 1989. Over 90,000 troops participating, hundreds of air and maritime assets. And we will continue to train like this. We're taking every opportunity to rehearse and refine our plans and to deliver the right amount of deterrence required at any given time in any given place. This modernization of NATO's collective defense will not be realized immediately. It will require relentless focus and determination from across NATO and in all member nations. And it will require non-military adjustment as well, such as in our defense industrial base, which will be such an important part of reestablishing and developing our deterrence. It will be difficult, but we are well on our way. The adaptation and transformation of the alliance in the past few years has been remarkable. I'm confident that we are ready to confront any challenge. Our nations remain committed, and they are united like never before. The world may be turning out to be a different place than we'd hope, but NATO is turning out to be exactly what we need. Dr. Mick, I look forward to questions. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, General Cavoli, for these thoughtful remarks and just the scope of what you have covered. We'll have an opportunity for in-person questions. There's a microphone to the right over there, so if you want to ask a question at the end of our conversation, please line up over there. And today's AC front page event is part of the ongoing Commanders series, generously supported by Saab to provide a forum for critical issues of national security concerns. So, General Cavoli, let me transition to my first question. In July, we will have a summit here in Washington. What are your top priorities for that summit? What would mean a successful deliverable for you from that perspective?
Well, I think the key thing from a military perspective at the summit, Andrew, is going to be able to say that the regional plans and the DDA family of plans, the strategic supporting plans, all the plans, so 10 in total, are in place and are active and are driving our operations. So as you know, previously we had the graduated response plans. Those were really designed to position forces, but weren't designed for the actual defense. Now we have the plans in place necessary to do that, and we'll transition to that. A whole lot of things will come out of that. You know, there'll be an announcement about command and control, I'm sure. There'll be some announcements about the amount of forces committed, which have significantly increased because of our new force model, changing from a rotational cyclical force generation model to standing levels of readiness. I think we'll see all of these things come out at the summit.
Okay. In your written statement before your testimony, before House Armed Services Committee, you described Russia as, quote, a long-term Russia problem, with Ukraine being just one example. Could you speak to that and tell us your views of what Russia is likely to be for the alliance going forward?
Sure. I think that's probably one of the most significant strategic questions we can ask ourselves today, right? After the Ukraine war, no matter how it works out, after the war in Ukraine is concluded, where will Russia be? And what threat will Russia pose? I believe Russia will pose a long-term threat to the alliance. We will have a big Russia problem for years to come. Russia will be on track to expand the size of its military. It's already announced its plans to do so. It's ramped up industrial production and manpower intake in order to achieve these goals. It will be reconstituting its losses as quickly as it can. It will be arrayed in the western parts of Russia and associated nations, perhaps, on the borders with NATO, and it will be a large, large force. It will be led largely by the same people, or people like them, and they have already declared their enmity toward NATO. And so I believe that that management of that problem, the military problem, and all of its political, economic, and social consequences that are going to come out of it will be really a driving factor of NATO's existence and global security for many years to come.
So let me follow up on the reconstitution question, because several U.S. government officials have stated that Russia might have already reconstituted its forces. Baltic leaders talk about a 3 to 5 year window. What is your assessment of where Russia is when it comes to force reconstitution? Because the delta between how quickly they can actually ready their forces and how quickly NATO can rearm and prepare, that's really the risk level for the alliance, isn't it?
Yeah, so it depends on what we're talking about specifically. Reconstituting the force inside Ukraine to continue that fight, or reconstituting its military at large. And then, of course, the question depends on which part of the forces we're talking about. So the ground forces have clearly taken the bulk of the attrition. They've lost more than 2,000 tanks. They've lost dozens of thousands of soldiers killed, over 100,000 wounded, so very significant, 200,000 wounded, very significant losses. But nevertheless, if we look inside Ukraine today, the Russian army in Ukraine is bigger now than it was at the beginning of the fight. So clearly the reconstitution quantitatively is moving fairly quickly. Qualitatively, I think we can assume or we can witness that many of the troops are not as high quality, that they're reaching a bit farther afield. A lot of the equipment fielded is older. It's refurbished, but it's based on an older model. But nevertheless, the reconstitution is happening now. What they'll do afterwards, I think, is the big question. And there are various estimates in the public and various classified estimates as well of how many years it's going to take them to constitute a large force that they would be able to array against NATO, Andrew. But I think it's not necessarily the right question, how fast can Russia do it? The question is, how fast can Russia build its force compared to how fast we're going to build our force? So that force structure requirement I talked about in my opening remarks, it's not reality in total yet, right? Some of it still needs to be built. Some of it needs to be produced. Some of it needs to be modernized. And our commitment to that force structure requirement and the speed with which we can get up to it is really going to decide whether Russia has the advantage or we have the advantage. So it's less an absolute question of how fast Russia can reconstitute and more of a relative question, will we reconstitute faster? And here we come to two questions. The first, of course, is political will. And the second, of course, is the structure, the responsiveness, the elasticity of our defense industrial base in the West. But one of those needs to be maintained, the former, and the latter needs to be developed and nurtured.
Well, so let's speak about the industrial base, because I think recently, it was last October at the Warsaw Security Forum, Admiral Rob Bauer actually made headlines by saying that expenditures on defense in Europe do not necessarily translate into actual capabilities, munitions production, and the rest of it because of the deficiencies in the industrial base, the lack of flexibility. What is your assessment of our relative position in that regard? How quickly can the alliance actually put the sufficient industrial capability into action to deliver what the NATO alliance needs?
So I don't think anybody is satisfied with current levels of production, current rates of production. Industry leaders I talk to are also not satisfied with it, and it's a complex interplay of government investment, government demand signal, and industry's ability to meet that demand signal, to anticipate it, agree to it, and meet it. So I don't think anybody's really satisfied right now. How we go forward is really the question. You know, Rob's made some great public comments about this, but I think how we go forward is the biggest question. And it's going to take a reestablishment of habits and practices and trust even between governments and industry. Industry having seen, for the most part, a decreasing amount of demand, a decrease in demand from governments over the last 30 years. Now for that suddenly to turn around, I think we're a little bit suffering some lag time in the turnaround of that. Nevertheless, there's some great initiatives. The EU has an initiative to build the industrial base. Has a lot of proposals. Some of them are a little bit controversial, but nevertheless, the discussion itself is bringing some of the improvements into reality. NATO has a council of the national directors of armaments. These national armaments directors get together and compare notes and talk about developing. And then country by country, countries are moving out. Slovakia, for instance, has greatly increased the amount of artillery shells it can produce. The United States is on a very big ramp up of missiles and artillery shells in particular. And I believe we'll get there. We just have to remember that it's a relative question against the adversary.
Understood. So last time when NATO planned for a large-scale near-peer adversary war, it was at 15 members. Today it's at 32. From your perspective, you're dual-hatted both as the Commanding General of EUCOM and SACEUR. What are the principal challenges of managing the alliance, leading the alliance at 32, especially considering we've got about 1,800 miles of NATO border now? Finland alone is 830 to deter and defend. What are the greatest challenges, and what are also the greatest positives of that enlarged alliance?
Well, the greatest positive, hands down, is the establishment of a larger body of like-minded nations that have banded together in a common cause, right? I mean, and that's the biggest advantage by far, because it brings political weight, it brings political power, it brings values-based oomph to our alliance. It is much better at 32 than at 15. Now, is it more complicated? Do more people have say? Of course, but that's always been the case. I think that to stare at the problems of individual voting patterns and saying 32 is so many more than, I think that looks at the leaves instead of seeing the forest. The forest is the fact that we have 32 nations now. Russia didn't expect this. Russia's goal is to disband NATO, is to force the irrelevance of NATO. It's gotten the exact opposite in this conflict. It's gotten the exact opposite. That's number one. Number two, the biggest advantages are geographical, right? The military advantages are geographical. The freedom of navigation on the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Bothnia previously was a contested notion. It's hard to see that now, right? There is vanishingly small amounts of shoreline along the Gulf of Bothnia and the Baltic Sea that are not NATO shorelines. That makes a fundamental difference. So the geometry of the fight changes significantly. So I think those are big advantages to us. In the particular case of the two nations that joined most recently, Sweden and Finland, those are great additions. I mean, these are high-end militaries that have always been focused on war fighting. Finland has been doing exactly what it's going to do in NATO now for decades, facing down a Russian threat on its immediate border. And they're highly proficient at it. They know what they're doing, and they have volunteered to step up and lead the way for the NATO ground forces in that area, and they're going to do that. Sweden, of course, is a very high-end military, growing rapidly with extremely sophisticated capabilities and a robust armaments industry. All of these things are major additions to the alliance. With both of those nations, we had decades of interoperability opportunities on training. We've worked together on operations to include combat operations in Afghanistan. So these were really easy things to assimilate and to integrate as a military matter.
In your opening comments, you spoke about how NATO has moved now from the previous mission of the 30 years when it was optimized for a different type of combat, different theaters, the peace dividend, the rest of it. Looking at what's been going on in Ukraine for over 2 years now, what are the most salient lessons for NATO, for the U.S. Military overall, for a kind of near-peer conflict that we may see threatened in Europe once again? What are the greatest lessons here?
Yeah, so I think the first lesson is you either win up front, fast and big, or you're in a long fight. So step one is to develop high-end capabilities and capacity at a high level of readiness so that you can win the first fight out of the starting blocks. Because what we see in Ukraine is if you don't, and you're facing a large adversary like Russia, you're going to end up in a long, protracted fight. And that fight requires a second feature, which is depth. Depth of personnel, reserves, systems to mobilize, extra equipment, munitions in sufficient stockpiles, industrial capacity that's ready to be activated or already activated to go. So win up front, but be ready to win long. That's the first lesson. I think the second lesson, you know, you get down into tactical lessons pretty quickly, but we do see that drone warfare is sort of democratizing the third dimension. Just about everybody on the battlefield can get something into the air now and affect you from the air. That's something we're going to have to wrestle with. We're still seeing it play out on both sides in Ukraine. How much, how capably. It's easy to overstate it. It's easy to overstate these things. But nevertheless, I think use of the third dimension is not new, but being so widespread and proliferated throughout the ranks and the formations, I think that's something new we'll have to deal with. There are tons of other things to look at, but I think one of the most important ones for 32 democracies to look at is the importance of civil-military relations in this fight. And we've seen it play out in both sides. When civilian leadership is good and strong, it can galvanize the nation, and when it interacts in a positive and constructive fashion with military leadership, it produces results on the battlefield. And we should always remember that. It's one of our greatest strengths inside the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's one of the greatest gifts we can cherish and nurture for generations to come.
Thank you. Before I ask my last question, let me remind you of the microphone. If you would like to ask a question, please line up over there behind the standing microphone, and we'll take it from there. Last question, General. China is supporting, helping, enabling, we can call it any way we want, what Russia has been doing in Ukraine. The same goes for Iran. The same goes for North Korea. I once called it the axis of dictatorships that's aligned itself against democracies. What lessons for the alliance would you draw from that? Because you're not really dealing just with the Russia problem set. You're also looking at this wider alliance against us. Even though I understand that Secretary General does not talk of China as an adversary, we are avoiding that description. But how do we respond to that? How does the alliance prepare against that kind of alignment against us?
Sure. So, yeah, a little bit controversial if we start at the right end of the spectrum of conflict, right? But if we start at the left end of the spectrum of conflict, pre-conflict activities, we discover that NATO, a geographically defined alliance, does have China challenges inside it right now.
Lines, of course.
So our resilience to those challenges, our ability to protect our strategic infrastructure, our ability to protect the intellectual property of our principal military systems, all of that, those are going to be our ability to protect our data. These are all going to be very important things for us to harden ourselves against and to be resilient against, because we can already see those challenges inside the European geography today.
And do we need to change our mindset also? You spoke about munitions. We used to live through this, just-in-time delivery systems during those 30 years. You spoke of the need to stockpile, to have reserves, to have redundancies in the system. Is this working itself through the alliance? Are we really understanding how profoundly the world has changed?
Sure it is. I think there are two pieces of evidence for that. One, objectively, is that we are changing the stockpile requirements that we require. So we have in our plans requirements for a certain amount of stockages of various different things that you need to fight a war with. We're changing those. We're revising those upwards. I think everybody would be doing that nationally anyway, but we as an alliance are doing that. The second is with regard to personnel. A number of nations in the alliance have elected to return to some form of conscription, some form of obligatory service. A number of other ones are considering it. And in fact, I think as we look ahead, I think manpower is going to be one of the biggest strategic challenges that we face as an alliance, and we're going to have to come to grips with that. Our human resources have to be built up and have to be accessible in the same way that industrial resources and production and war stocks are.
Okay, let me pause here now, turn over to the audience for question. If you would like to ask a question, please line up at the mic. Please identify yourself and pose your question, please.
Okay, thank you very much. General, thanks for joining us today. Jeff Mankoff with National Defense University. You talked a lot about the steps that NATO's taken for territorial defense and deterrence. As we know, the most vulnerable places and the most likely triggers for a conflict are countries that are not in NATO, countries like not just Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and others. Could you say something about the steps that NATO has taken in order to defer and deter aggression against these countries and better prepare them, and what you think still needs to be done?
Sure. Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because you know, the alliance exists for the alliance, right? The alliance exists to defend the other members of the alliance, but we don't exist in a vacuum, and we need friends and partners as well as allies. And we have a partnership program in the alliance. We designate partners in the alliance. Allied Command Operations has more than 30 active partnerships right now, formally recognized by NATO and by the nation making that partnership. Georgia and Moldova are both partner nations formally designated. Some of them participate in what we call the force pool, which means they make themselves available for some of our operations, such as KFOR. There are several non-allies operating in KFOR right now. In Georgia in particular, NATO has had an office and a robust training and interoperability campaign for some years, for about a dozen years, and that continues today. In Moldova, nations bilaterally have a lot going on, and NATO has a small office there as well. We do, you know, we adjust the level of effort as we look around the world. Those certainly aren't the only two partners we have, but we spend a lot of time looking at it. I think it's an important point to note that many nations that have previously or historically been considered geographically influenced by Russia are looking westward right now and are looking to establish new security partners and to shed themselves of older, less reliable security partners. And that's something we spend a lot of time thinking about as well.
Okay, ma'am.
Hello, I'm Liis Muir. I'm the defense counselor at the Estonian Embassy. And may I first say, I think I speak for many people on the eastern flank that we are really appreciative and grateful for your work. I think especially with the regional plans, this is really great stuff. My question actually is for you more than as the head of EUCOM rather than Sakur. What would the implications, in your view, be to the US force posture in Europe from these new regional defense plans and also the new minimum military requirements, considering the composition of forces, how they are rotated, but also the geographical footprint of the American forces in Europe? Thank you so much.
Thanks. And first of all, let me thank Estonia for everything you do for the alliance. Not just in terms of thought leadership, but also in terms of innovative approaches to national defense and your approaches to mobilizing not just your military, but your society in its own defense. Your devotion to Article 3, something that comes before Article 5, that's impressive indeed. So my congratulations to Estonia, my gratitude. We have to divide the question into two parts, ma'am, I think, right? The first question is, what is the requirement? You know, how much is required? The U.S. will always provide what is required of the U.S. for those parts. There is strong policy behind this. It's bipartisan. It's always been there. We will provide what we are supposed to provide. Right now, I don't think it's really public information, but the United States has, under our force sourcing construct for the regional plans, the United States has pledged at various levels of attachment, more force than it has in decades to the regional plans. So I'm very confident about the United States' commitment to these plans, to their executability, not just their executability, but to their rapid success. I'm very confident in that. How the U.S. does it, whether it does it with rotational forces, permanent forces, that's a much more complex interplay of budget, availability of forces, readiness requirements, other global requirements, frankly, domestic political requirements. So all of that comes together, and a lot of that's outside of my sandbox.
We have time for one more question. Please, sir.
Thanks. I'm Matt McKeag with MITRE. Sir, you've spoken quite a bit about the need for U.S. and NATO to be able to counter Russian mass on the ground. Can you also talk about how you see, with the new members of NATO and possibly following on the previous question, the interplay between air forces and the ability of the air to counter ground mass and momentum through traditional roles like close air support and things like that across a full NATO force? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So NATO's air forces are a great and growing success story in my mind, right? They're well-trained, they're well-equipped, and where they're not well-equipped, they're planning on becoming well-equipped. So we are rapidly moving into 4th generation plus and 5th generation exclusively across the alliance. So the Saab Gripen, of course, very high-end aircraft, the French Rafale, very, very high-end aircraft, and the F-35, well-known, a multinational platform that's now proliferating. By 2030, there are going to be more than 600 F-35s in the alliance in Europe. As you know, every plane you add to a 5th generation network is worth more than just one airframe, right? Because you increase the size of the network of sensors and everything that's operating. And our ability to move beyond that platform specificity and to wrap the other high-end platforms together with Saab and with the French Rafale, our ability to do that is going to just increase even more greatly. So I'm very, very confident about our ability to wage high-end warfare. General Scorch Hecker, who commands NATO Air Command, and his deputy Johnny Stringer, Air Marshal Johnny Stringer, are extremely active. They have a very strong, very realistic training program that focuses on all the high-end threats that we have today. Of course, focusing on the exquisite end of aerial combat means you're probably not able to focus as much on close air support and things like that. And that's something we're wrestling with inside the alliance. The good news is that the alliance does retain a huge number of 4th generation aircraft, so we still have the capabilities to do it. And we're looking through the ways that you maintain both capabilities going far into the future. I hope that answered your question, sir.
Well, thank you very much. We're about out of time. So first of all, I'd like to thank General Cavoli. Chris,
thank you. Great.
Thank you for being here with us and for this really insightful discussion of how dramatically the alliance has evolved in a positive direction. Let's emphasize
Absolutely.
that. Even though there is a lot of work to be done, we very much look forward to welcoming you again to the Atlantic Council. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us in person. Greatly appreciate your attention. I hope this was a useful discussion for all of you. Thank you on behalf of the Atlantic Council.
Thanks, Andrew.